Hello and welcome to Inclusion Dialogue, a podcast where we discuss everything related to inclusive education and diversity in the classroom. My name is Joanne Banks and I'm a lecturer in Trinity College Dublin in the School of Education. This podcast consists of interviews between me and leading academics from all over the world where we discuss how we define inclusive and special education. We look at the difference between theory and practice and what inclusion looks like on the ground in our schools. I began this project for my students, and it was to allow them to hear the views of researchers that I was getting them to read in the form of journal articles and research reports. I've been pretty overwhelmed by the response though, and I think as the podcast has grown, it will be of a much broader appeal to other academics, to policymakers, to educators and practitioners, to parents, but also to students themselves. My guest this week is Professor Mel Ainscow, who is Emeritus Professor at the University of Manchester. He's an internationally recognised authority on the promotion of inclusion and equity in education. In our interview, he emphasises the importance of taking individual school and area contexts into account when introducing inclusive education systems. And in the podcast, we finished talking about his work in UNESCO today in countries around the world. Here he believes that we should view inclusion as a journey and learn from other countries who are further down the road than we are. Okay, Mel, thank you so much for meeting with me this morning. I really appreciate you taking the time out to discuss these critical issues around inclusive education. I have been a fan of your work for many, many years, and as have my students are very involved in reading your literature as well. So I'm really interested to hear your views and opinions on what shaped your perspectives on inclusive education over the years. Could I possibly start by asking you your early career and how you began working in this field?
Okay, well, it's a pleasure to be part of this series, and I hope it will be useful particularly to your students, of course. My story is quite a long one. Despite my youthful appearance, I'm quite old. So I'll give a kind of potted version and connect it to the agenda of this particular series, really. I trained as an art teacher, and I taught in a very tough school in inner city Manchester. And frankly, I wasn't a very good art teacher. And after a while, I drifted with no particular mission into special education, and I worked for some years in special schools, and eventually I was the head teacher of a special school in the West Midlands in England, and after that I went on to work in a local authority as what was called an advisor. I was the advisor for special educational needs, and then there came a moment where I got an opportunity to go and work at the University of Cambridge. I kind of got in when nobody was watching through the back door, I think, really. And so mid-career, I really took an agenda into my work as an academic from all those experiences in different schools, almost totally. Schools serving quite disadvantaged communities. So my preoccupation with disadvantage, my preoccupation with children who get marginalised or excluded in one form or another, went with me into the academic world. And then I spent almost 10 years at the University of Cambridge, which was a fantastic experience in what was then called the Institute of Education. All our work was in working with practitioners, obviously with training and master's degrees and so forth. But also I worked with a marvellous group of people there, where we developed a way of working where we worked with education systems and with schools. And given my agenda, coming from the field, it fitted perfectly, really, because I couldn't pretend to be a rather traditional academic who does research on the field. I wanted to be some kind of academic who was actually working with the field, working collaboratively with teachers, policymakers, whoever else is involved, politicians in education. So through that work at Cambridge, we developed a model of working, if you will, which is still there with me today as I work with education systems. At that time, if you reflect on your career, particularly when you get to my stage, you realize that all the way through, there are all sorts of moments of chance that take you in a direction that you couldn't have anticipated. And at that time, this was around about 1990, there was a massive debate going on globally under the theme of what was called Education for All. In 1990, there was a major conference in Jomtien in Thailand, where leaders from around the world, prime ministers, presidents, ministers of education, came together to discuss the crisis that was then perceived in education, and they formed a kind of movement which continued for 10 years and then beyond, which came to be known as Education for All. And so my interest, having worked with disadvantaged kids and kids who have difficulty, was very much central to that idea. How do we develop education systems nationally which can reach out to all children? And I was fortunate that at that point I became involved in a UNESCO. UNESCO is the main United Nations organization that is preoccupied with education. I became involved in a project which was called Special Needs in the Classroom. I wouldn't call it that now, but that was what it was called. And initially we did action research in 8 countries. And as a result of that, we created a teacher education pack, which is still used in some parts of the world now. But as a result of that, I've continued since then on various kind of projects for UNESCO. I've just completed one recently where we've been working with national systems around the world. And I think the phrase education for all, which I like, because it's simple, straightforward, people in the street can understand it. You know, when we start using words like inclusion, and now it's more often we talk about inclusion and equity, we might want to come back to that in a few moments. I think those phrases, because they're so difficult to understand, if you're not very careful, become a kind of barrier to progress. So the notion of this being education for all is central to what I'm about.
We'll talk about the international work in a moment, but can I just go back to, you mentioned there the 1990 and kind of pre-Salamanca time. You mentioned there being a crisis in education. Can you describe a little bit what were the pressing problems of that time?
Yeah, the crisis in 1990, as it was expressed, was mostly, of course, about developing countries, countries with poor economic situations. And at that point, I can't remember the figure, there was something like, I think, 130 million children out of school, because where they lived, there was no school, there was no teachers. And so the main priority of Education for All was to encourage, pressurize governments to invest in education systems. And I think, you know, that has had, it continues today. It's now part of what's called Education 2030. And the phrase Education for All has rather got lost. And I mean, the priority now is inclusion and equity. But I mean, that's an interesting story in itself, really, because you mentioned Salamanca. For those who don't know, Salamanca was a conference held in 1994 in the city of Salamanca, 4 years after the conference which had launched Education for All. And that conference in Salamanca was to ask the question, what is the place of what they called special needs education in relation to Education for All? Now, I think that historically is quite an important moment and an important point to reflect on. I'll put it like this. Having decided in 1990 the priority is Education for All, why do you need another conference 4 years later? Does it imply that Education for All means actually education for almost all, on the basis that, of course, there are always children who are dealt with separately? Now, that's the history, and it's in all our countries, and it's certainly in all our minds, that, you know, some children historically have been dealt with separately in special institutions, in special schools, in special classes, and so on. So following 1994, part of the kind of movement that I certainly felt part of, a kind of loosely coupled movement, if you will, was to try to convince people that actually Education for All means all. And what we're trying to do is to bring together this historic fragmentation where you have parallel education systems and put them together into one project, into one strategy. Now, the new policy, which merged in 2016 around Sustainable Development Goal 4, there are 17 Sustainable Development Goals, 4 is about education, makes it very clear now. Education for All means all, and the headlines of that movement now internationally are an attempt to create education systems which are inclusive and equitable. Now, I think for many of us who've been involved in this process over the last, golly, 30 years, that in itself was a conceptual victory to actually convince people now there is only one project. Now, in 2017, I led the development for UNESCO of a booklet, which is on the UNESCO website, so colleagues might want to have a look at it, and it's called Ensuring Inclusion and Equity in Education. And in that booklet, we had a group of international experts that developed that material. We created a mantra, and it's this: every learner matters and matters equally. Every learner matters and matters equally. And that's the kind of spirit, and more than the spirit, the principle that is guiding now the international movement. Now, one has to be realistic about this kind of stuff. And for your students particularly, you need to study these international trends and developments. There's lots of publications. But we have to be realistic of their impact. You know, they are political rhetoric. They're useful to people like me who see themselves as activists. I mean, as well as being some kind of academic, I'm an activist. I want to make things happen. And so I can use these documents and these statements and these conceptualizations to argue for things and to convince people and say, this is not just what's happening in Dublin or Manchester or wherever in the world. This is a global movement. So I think this is part of a kind of tactical thing for me, to try to bring people together using these kind of policy frameworks and this kind of language as kind of symbols against which we can all rally.
And you mentioned they're working with individual countries from both developing and developed, for want of better language, economic contexts. Are the problems posed differently in different national contexts in your experience?
Yeah, well, it's very easy to slip into rhetoric about these kind of things, and I'm probably guilty of that in a sense. But I mean, one bit of rhetoric which I'm absolutely convinced of is that context matters. And what might work in one place might not work in another place. Because the nature of contexts, and when I say contexts, national context, of course, but then it's not even national, because it may be different between Dublin and Tipperary, you know, that the place and the history of the place, the structures, the traditions, the resources create barriers. You see, another concept that we've used quite a lot, another source that colleagues might want to have a look at, in the late 1990s in England, we developed an instrument called the Index for Inclusion. And that index was meant to be a framework for reviewing and developing individual schools in relation to notions of inclusion. It was launched in 2000. It was sent to every school in England, and it was meant, we had a group of people who worked on it, and it was meant to be a kind of tactical interruption in a policy period in England where we were quite worried that policy was actually creating more losers in order to create more winners. What we had no expectation of, and it was beyond our imagination, was that index would actually become an international movement in itself. And I've lost track now, but it's certainly been translated into something like 40 languages and are used around the world. Now,
and can I ask what did it look like? Like what kind of evaluation piece?
Yeah, if colleagues want to have a look at it, if you just Google Index for Inclusion, you can get the 2002 copy. It's been kind of redrafted a few times. My preference is for the 2002 copy, because that copy is really aimed at school review and development. It's an instrument for school review and development, right? And all my work is based on the principle that as far as school development is concerned, and this is school development that we're talking about, most of the resources that are needed to make this happen are usually there in schools. And my experience is that schools know more than they use. So when I work with a school, or more usually with networks of schools, what I try to do is to develop a process of inquiry, action research, if you will, where teachers and others investigate their own context. And the two concepts that are in the index, which are quite crucial to this, one is the identification of barriers. And I use barriers as a metaphor to mean many things. The curriculum can be a barrier, the assessment system can be a barrier, teacher training can be a barrier, and lack of resources can be a barrier. But often the most difficult barriers are those in our minds, the limitations of our own imagination. So part of the analysis is, what are the barriers? And the other side of the coin is, what are the resources, especially the human resources, that can be mobilized to address those barriers? Now, going back to your question about the index provides a framework for doing that, for analysing particular school contexts and saying, what are the barriers, what are the resources? It's been widely used, and it remains problematic. I mean, the concepts are deeply in my mind and guide everything I do. I can't say that I use the index in its form very much. But I think what I would say about the index, that's why for your students it might be worth looking at, it's probably the most comprehensive analysis of what an inclusive school should look like. What are the factors we need to do to take a school in an inclusive direction? That's its strength, but that's also its weakness. It's very detailed, and in practical terms, it's quite difficult to use. And we've seen that in various parts of the world. But the central concepts are what I use all the time now. It's about analysing context. It's about gathering evidence, starting with statistics, but then using other evidence, mutual observation, listening to the views of children, all sorts of other, views of families and so on, and then using that evidence to analyse our school, to develop a strategy for taking our school forward. So for me, you see, inclusion isn't a state. It isn't, is this an inclusive school, or if it's not an inclusive school, it's a process, it's a journey. And there's another video you can find on the internet if you look, where I say every school is inclusive to some extent. The video is called that. My argument is that whatever the school is like, whatever stage it's at, it will be inclusive to some. So the journey is taking every school forward in the belief that actually probably there never will be an inclusive school. It's an impossible dream, because there will always be new children come along who will create new challenges, which mean we have to think again. So the schools that I'm thinking about that I've known in different parts of the world that have made progress, they're schools that are on a journey. They're schools that use inquiry to examine themselves. They're schools that develop very powerful forms of professional learning in the school. And of course, there are schools that are managed and led with all that as being part of their agenda.
It's really interesting to hear you say that, because Ireland, I don't know if you've been following the Irish context, but recently we've had a consultation on whether we should move to a full inclusive system, as in remove special class and special school provision. And there's been quite a lot of fallout since that, and we had a conference here last year, and one of the questions at the conference was, how do we know if we've made it, if we have the inclusive school? So I think the measurement of it, or an index for it, is quite reassuring for principals who might feel that it's a leap that they simply cannot make, rather than seeing it as a kind of a gradual process like what you just described.
You see, we're talking about a transformative approach, and that's what's in the UNESCO materials. We talk about the transforming education systems in order to transform societies. And therefore it's challenging, and it's difficult, and it's not going to happen in a week or a month or a year. It's an ongoing process, really. And what we know about educational change is that it's difficult. Tony Blair spoke at a conference recently, and he was asked, what was the thing that you learned most as Prime Minister? And he said, without thinking, what I've learned is that changing education systems is difficult. And it's difficult, not because people are lazy or resistant, although of course some may be, but mainly because the opposite. People are so busy, people are so engaged, and the most important policymakers, of course, are particularly busy. Who are the most important policymakers? Teachers in the classroom. And so we need a transformative process which operates at every level of the system, at national government level, at local level, community level, school level, but most importantly at the classroom level. And if we look at the countries that have made greatest progress, they are the schools where teachers are highly regarded, and where teachers are supported and are in a process of professional learning, as well as in terms of bringing about developments in their school. So the need to invest in teachers is absolutely crucial to all of this.
And what do you say to people, which I presume you have this debate and argument the world over, is about, say, the special school system or the special class system? Can they exist in an inclusive system, according to your work with UNESCO, for example? Is that part of it?
I mean, I think probably this is one of my many failures, really. I've had so many attempts. You see, I was head of a special school. I was head teacher of a special school. And we tried to set up the school as a resource centre in that local community. And we did lots of interesting things in those days, really. And then subsequently, as an advisor, I worked with the various special schools in the authority I was working with. We had a very strong professional development programme going on, and it included rethinking the role of special schools. But it's very difficult to take that forward. I think a pragmatic way forward, which there's an argument for more generally, is the creation of networks of schools. And I think that in the work I do, for example, here in the United Kingdom, I've worked on a whole series of system change projects over the years. a lot of the emphasis we placed is on building networks and collaboratives of various kinds that can take different shape. And if you can create that sense of schools supporting one another, then clearly you can start to integrate the segregated provision. Sorry to use that phrase, but that's what it is. It's provision which separates children. You can start to integrate it into the system. And in so doing, of course, and this is the vital thing, we must not lose the expertise that's there. You see, that expertise has got to be adopted and adapted so that it fits in with a system change process. So it's a slow job, that I think, really. And I can't say that I have a great success about it, but I remain committed to it as an idea.
Can I just move on? I'm not going to keep you much longer, but can I just move on to your current work in UNESCO? And you mentioned the 2030 as being the next point of reflection and change, if you like. Can you describe that a little bit more for me, and what basically is the emphasis in UNESCO at present?
Yeah, well, we've just published another report that literally was published in the last few weeks, which traces the story back to Salamanca and explains the developments. And your students, again, would be good to have a look at that that report, because it traces, again, we had a group of international experts working on it. It traces the international developments through the journey that I've just briefly summarised. It also points to examples of very promising practices in different parts of the world. So, in a sense, the journey continues. And over the last 3 years, I've been working particularly in Latin America. We have 9 countries that are part of a network there. Latin America is particularly challenging because of the problems of resources and poverty, and especially inequality. I mean, not far behind all of this discussion is the nature of inequality within societies. And therefore, it's fairly logical that the education systems that have more inclusive, more equitable education systems are those that are in fairer societies, more equal societies. People often point to Finland, they point to parts of Canada, for example. But interesting, some of the very interesting developments are in places like Portugal and Italy as well. So there are countries, and in mentioning countries, and in the report I've just mentioned, we give examples of the various countries. In mentioning countries, I often say, but remember, there's nobody who's cracked this. If this is about education for all, there's no country in the world that educates all of its children effectively. That's why it's a journey. But clearly some countries are further down the road, and we can learn from them, but they don't give us the quick answer. They give us a sense of what you have to do. But remember what I said earlier, context matters. So you have to start from where you are in Ireland or in England or wherever we're talking about, building on the good things that are always there, and then identifying the barriers and working together. You see, the other thing I would want to stress about all of this, and it's implicit in everything I said, it's sometimes said about school improvement, and what we're talking about is school improvement, remember. I've called this school improvement with attitude, right? School improvement based on a set of deep principles, really. What is often said about school improvement, it's technically simple, but socially complex. It's not that difficult to say the kind of things that need to happen. I've got publications where I've tried to articulate that, as of other people who are part of this series that you are producing, really. So it's not that difficult to explain what needs to happen. The challenge is to get people together to make it happen. And when you look at the successful experiences, and I've seen some successful experiences in some of the poorest parts of the world, in parts of Africa and Latin America and so on, it's always a social thing. It's about people getting together and saying, we're going to make this happen. My conclusion, which I quote in all my publications, is the most important thing is the collective will to make it happen. People getting together and say, we're going to work together to make sure all of our kids get a good education.
Okay, Mel, that was really great. Like, before I finished my questions that I wanted to kind of throw at you this morning, but is there anything else that you'd like to raise before I let you get back to your day?
No, the publication I've just met, it would be useful if you can find the link for that.
I will. I'll post that and make that available. Yeah, no problem.
Have you seen it?
I have, yeah. You sent it to me in an email a couple of weeks ago. Yeah.
No, the only thing I would say is if colleagues would want to get in touch with me with specific questions, I'm very happy to answer emails and things.
Great.
People can feed my email on the University of Manchester or indeed the University of Glasgow website. I'm part-time in both universities these days.
Okay, busy. Well, thank you so much for your time this morning. I really, really appreciate it, and I really enjoyed that conversation. So thanks again.
I hope you took something from that interview, so thank you for listening. Feel free to spread the word and share the episode. You can find out more from my academic website, bankoninclusion.com, and I will catch you next time.